everybody, Mike Iaconelli back out here in the shop, and we have a very, very good one for you today. And in today's shop, we're going to be talking about how to select and how to rig the right chunk for your jig, for your skirted jig. You know, this is one of my favorite trailers to fish on a skirted jig, especially when the water is cold. Late fall, winter, into the spring, I love these chunk style trailers. But let me tell you, there's more to a chunk than just taking it out of the pack and putting it on your jig. And that's what this shop is all about. All right, let's get started. Chunk style baits, trailers. What are they? And then I really want to talk about size. And then we're going to start talking about which style to choose and how to rig it, okay? Let's start with defining a chunk. Now, if you're one of the old fishermen watching this, you know exactly what this is. This is the old piece of Uncle Josh pork rind, right? This is the old pork style trailers. You know, I got to be honest with you. I really believe that in today's era of soft plastics, how they can make these things, I don't think there's a need for old Uncle Josh pork anymore, especially when it comes to the really soft Senate baits like the Max Scent chunks, right? They are flimsy and wet and they smell. They're very much like the old pork. So, you know, when you look at these style baits, and let me get both out, so I want to show you the difference. When you look at them, there's some similarities in chunks. And, you know, the one is they have a fat section, and, you know, on those old pork rind baits, that was the pig fat that was on there. So they have a fat section, and that fat section gives you buoyancy, it gives you body, it gives you an area to rig or hook, right? So a fat section of the pork. And then it comes down to these straight legs. And these legs on your chunk are really the deal on getting more bites. You know, I get asked all the time, do you ever fish a skirted jig without a trailer? And the answer is no, never. I never fish a skirted jig without a chunk. But when that water gets cold, instead of the crawls or the double tail grubs or the creatures with movement and appendages, when the water gets cold, remember, late fall, winter, early spring, into spring, those chunk legs are the deal because they're just very fluid, right? The colder the water, the more you want the action of your jig trailer to be fluid and neutral, right? You're matching the water temperature. You're matching the activity level of the fish. But don't get it wrong, guys. These chunks have action. They're not no action trailers. They have action. They're just very fluid, okay? So when I'm talking chunks, I break them down into two separate categories. And, you know, the one is the old traditional pork style chunk, right? And when you look at it, it just has these straight tapered legs, nothing else. The old, just chunk style trailer. The next one is the chunk style trailer that has the rabbit ears on the back, okay? The main difference between those two trailers is your traditional chunk style, old pork style trailer versus the rabbit ears. The rabbit ears have a little more action, okay? So in those situations when you want a little more neutral action or you want a little less neutral action, that's the difference on when I pick those two chunks. So let me give you an example. Cold, super cold, freezing temperatures and clear water where I just want that thing just flowing, right? I would go to the old pork chunk style trailer because it's very minimal flow. But if my water's a little dirtier, if the water's still cold, but it's a little warmer still, I like the rabbit ears because it gives me just a little more fluidity, right? So rabbit ears, a little more action, warmer water in the late fall, warmer water in the spring, rabbit ears. Old chunk style, pork style trailer, cleaner water, less active fish, super cold water. Water in the low 40s to mid 30s, like ice cold. That one, right? So little subtle difference there. And then I want to make sure that you understand that I'm using two different size chunk trailers, okay? So we have, this is what I would call the standard size, which are, and again, this is a Berkley Maxcent chunk. I have the Berkley Maxcent meaty chunk, and they also make them in power bait. So you have the same chunk and meaty chunk in the regular power bait. But these baits are 3 1/4 and 3 1/2 inches long, right? That's a pretty standard size. And I'm using that bigger chunk trailer, both styles, when I'm using bigger jigs, right? Full-size jigs, full-size flipping jigs, full-size football jigs. I'm using the standard size chunks. But they also make these chunks in these small sizes. These are the Berkley Power Bait Power Chunks, Power Chunk and Meaty Chunk. And these are just scaled down versions. This is the 2 1/2 and 2.75. So here's a look at the small chunks trailers, right? And this is an important size for me because when I'm using those finesse or compact jigs, that's a missile mini flip jig, compact, I don't want to overpower that jig with that big standard size trailer, right? It's out of proportion. So I love the smaller chunks for the smaller jigs, okay? All right. I want to talk about rigging this chunk now. And this is another really, really important part of this process of fishing a jig and chunk is how to rig that chunk on the back. It's not as easy as just throwing it on there. I basically rig the chunk 2 different styles depending on the profile that I want to give that jig. Now let me explain that. I am super, super big on a thing called match to hatch, which means you want to match the length, the bulk, all of it. You want to match that forage, okay? So in situations when I want that jig and chunk to be small, I'm going to thread the chunk, okay? I'm going to thread the chunk. So let's look at this example. Again, this is a missile mini flip, 1/2 ounce mini flip jig. If I'm fishing a place and the crawfish are real small, the bluegill are real small, little gobies, whatever that forage is, if it's small, I want a small profile. So I'm going to take this jig, I'm going to put it in my left hand and pull back that skirt all the way. Pull it back like getting an umbrella and folding the umbrella backwards, right? I'm going to pull that skirt back. And then I'm going to get that chunk, whatever, it works on both styles, whether it's a pork style chunk or whether it's the rabbit ear. And I'm actually going to thread that chunk on, right? And just like you're threading any other trailer on a jig, I'm going to pop it through the head of that pork. I'm going to push it all the way through and out on the bottom of that fat on that chunk. And the last thing I'm going to do on most of these jigs, this is a missile mini flip. It's got a 360-degree keeper. I'm going to push it over that keeper so it locks it in, okay? So I'm going to thread that chunk when I want to keep that profile smaller, right? Because by threading it, it pulls the chunk up the shank of the hook. But there's another scenario, and this one is when I want to increase the profile of my jig. And again, think about your forage. We're trying to match a hatch here. If you're fishing a place that has big crawfish, big bluegill, big crustaceans, eels, big stuff on the bottom, right? Suckers, they're feeding on big stuff. I want this jig to be big, the profile, okay? So on this one, let's use a full-size missile headbanger football jig, right? Fish this a lot in the cold weather. We're not going to thread that rabbit ear chunk. We're going to just hook it through the fat, okay? But before we do that, think about that. If I hook it through the fat, I'm going to show you. If I hook it through the fat, let's look at how that chunk sits on that hook. It's going to fall. It's going to want to slide back as you're working it. And when it slides back, it has a tendency to do this, to ball the chunk up on the point of the hook. Real easy fix on this, guys. To get rid of that problem, keep your old soft stick baits. Keep your old Yum Dingers, Berkley Power Bait General, Senkos. Keep the old broken ones, because we're going to use that plastic as a spacer to prevent that chunk from flipping on itself. So, you know, all I do is you can get your scissors, cut off about a 3-inch section of that soft stick bait. And the first thing I'm going to do when I want a big profile with my jig is I'm going to thread on that little piece of soft stick bait. This is a Berkley Power Bait General. And I'm threading it on there. I'm pushing it above that 360-degree keeper. And that's what it looks like right there. And that one little add-on is going to give me a spacer so that when I hook on that chunk, guys, guess what? Now it can't go any further. It can't turn around on itself. Look, there's not enough gap there. And it's going to increase your hookup percentage. It's also a great little spot if you want to put in a glass rattle or a little BB rattle. You could insert it in that body as well, okay? But now I want to talk about how I'm going to rig this chunk when I'm going through the fat, when I want to make it a big profile, right? If you watch some of the shorts I've come out with, you know this trick, but I want to show it to you. I never just take this chunk out of the pack and just rig it on like that. I want to make a modification that's going to help me keep that chunk on there and keep it from pulling off when a fish grabs it or when I'm skipping trees or skipping docks. And guys, it's so easy, this modification. And we're going to use a keeper, a screw lock keeper or a hitchhiker. A lot of guys call them hitchhikers. And we're going to use this keeper to help keep that chunk on. And if you look at these little screw locks, guys, all they are is little, they look like little corkscrews, like a wine key. And before I put that chunk on that jig, I'm going to get that little corkscrew and I'm just going to go right in the head of the chunk. Okay, there's what it looks like going down. I'm going to go all the way. I'm going to keep going. There's what it looks like going in. And I'm literally going to screw that thing as low as I can get it. And if there's any of that little wire sticking out, you could just get your nips, just cut that piece off. It's real easy to cut off. And now that wire is inside the fat part of that chunk. So now when I go to hook that chunk, and I'm going to do it about 1/8 of an inch down from the head of that chunk, when I hook that chunk, I'm going through the spring. I can feel it going through the spring. Guess what? Watch this, guys. I'm pulling on it. That chunk is not moving. I'm pulling on that thing. It's not moving. So when I want a big profile, look at the difference, guys. Little profile, threading the chunk. Big profile, I'm going through the fat of the chunk. And it can make a big difference when you're trying to match that forge. All right, one last thing, guys, is the correct way to rig the chunk. Now listen, I'm going to have some guys in the comments, I know, argue this, but let me tell you my theory on fat side up or fat side down, okay? I've seen this argument over the years, guys, and I want to give you my reasoning behind it, okay? Let's rig another one. Again, we got a black and blue flip out full-size jig. Going to get my little piece of soft plastic stick bait. I'm going to get my screw lock. It's already in there on that one. I don't know if you could see it. But when I rig this chunk, whether it's the standard pork style or the rabbit ear, doesn't matter. Do I want that fat side facing up or do I want it facing down? My theory is fat side up, okay? So when I rig it through that screw lock, I want that meaty part of the chunk to be facing up. And here's my reason. When that jig is laying on the bottom, and remember guys, I'm using chunks in cooler water, cold water, late fall, wintertime, early spring. When that fish comes to get it, I'm fishing that on the bottom. I'm not swimming it high, I'm not burning it. I'm fishing it on the bottom. When that fish comes and bites it, I want the first thing that he feels on that bait is the fat, right? I want him to feel that fattier side of that chunk. So that fish comes down on it. He's not coming up. He's not coming from the side. He's coming down on it. And I want him to feel that fat. I want him to get that fat side of that chunk in his mouth. The other thing with the fatter side is there's more plastic there, which means there's more buoyancy there. And I always want that buoyancy to be toward the top because as I'm working that jig, I want that chunk flowing up, right? Think about a crawfish. Look at that, defensive position with his crawls up. Think about a bluegill. Let me get the little one for that. Think about a bluegill feeding, right, on the bottom and his tail's facing up. That fish is facing down. So on rigging the chunk, I always want to rig it fat side up. All right, guys, there you have it. That was a really long explanation on how to rig a chunk on your jig. Give it a try when that water's cold, whether it's the rabbit ear and a compact or whether it's the old pork style on a full size. Chunks can really get you a lot more bites. Try those tips and you're going to catch more fish. Listen, before you go, hit that subscribe button down there. Subscribe to my channel. If you do, we're going to send you a notification on a new video dropping every single week. If you're already subscribed, tell your friends about Mike Iaconelli Fishing on YouTube. We're here to help you become a better angler. Try those pork tips, try those chunk tips, and you're going to catch a lot of fish. Bye. Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli. I hope you enjoyed this week's In the Shop. I hope you learned a little bit. And if you like these videos, remember, there's a whole boatload. Check out these two, and you're going to learn more about bass fishing.